right. Contingent offers. So I feel like I've been trying to do this one class for a long time, but things have been building up to this. So I'm really happy to be able to do the 22B today. So we'll be discussing contingent offers, how to use the 22B, talking about what steps we need to take as a buyer's agent and a seller's agent. And we will be looking at real life situations that are maybe odd places you might find yourself and how to navigate through that. Okay, so first I wanted to start with a question. Can a seller ever be contingent on finding a new house? Unfortunately, in Washington state, the contract does not allow the seller to be contingent on finding a new house. They cannot cancel that contract. So they cannot, for this reason, make their home contingent on finding the new home. Sorry, it's just a contingency for buyers. Hey, Kelly. So this right here is the 22B, and I wanted to just highlight a couple things that might have changed. So basics on this are filling out the property that the buyer has to sell. The contingency period is 45 days as a boilerplate, unless you specify otherwise. But now, because of the new form change, you can actually negotiate how many days before the home will go on the market. So if your seller needs more than 5 days, it's now an option in paragraph A. Paragraph B has remained the same, though, because the contingency is just for this reason, to make sure that the home has sold by the time that they've specified above. Make sure you leave none of those dates blank. None of them can be ambiguous. You have to have actual dates for these things. So what happens if the homes does not sell? Well, you have the option and opportunity to try to sell this home within the dates that you specified. So for the conversation, I'm just going to use 45 days. So say you go under contract with your 22B buyer and they end up failing to sell their house before the end of the contingency period. Their home can be put back on the market. They do not fall out of contract with their first seller, and they still have the remaining days in the contingency period to try to sell their home again. If they fail to close and the expiration date comes in, they can either walk away because they did their best, they tried to sell it and it didn't happen, or they can go ahead and waive the contingency protection and move forward to close on the new house. So when would you use a 22B? Make sure that when you use the 22B, it's because your client has to sell something. If you have a buyer that has to sell their home in order to purchase another, you should use this form. It should be close to the time that your buyer is ready to list. Obviously, they're going to need as few days as possible in there to get their offer accepted. And no longer are they required to use 5 days, but it is a negotiated time frame. So let's talk about satisfying versus waiving. The seller has to keep their house on the market. The seller has to be in contingent status unless the contingency is satisfied or waived. Before that time, it is still contingent, no matter what. The seller can accept an offer. This property or this paragraph right here is your bump paragraph. So you're going to want to keep in mind your bump days. If your buyer were to waive the contingency for any reason, or for waive the contingency, not satisfy the contingency, it is required to close within 30 days. Here we go. This is right here, the difference between satisfying and waiving. A contingency satisfied means the buyer has done everything they need to uphold their end of the contract. So they've sold their home, they've given proper notice, they've had permission to accept an offer, and a waiver completely waives all contingencies and requires a closing. So be really mindful when you have sellers that are at the point where you need to give notice for this contingency. You don't want to waive the contingency if you're actually satisfying it, because you'll put your buyer or your seller, depending on who you represent, I guess, you'll put that 22B buyer in a position where they will waive all their contingency rights. All right, so contingencies that survive. What happens if you waive a 22A during your transaction with your 22B buyer? So if you waive a 22A while you have a 22B buyer, the contingency still survives. You're only waiving the contingency that they've asked you to waive. What about the septic? If you have a buyer with a 22B and they do a septic inspection or a well inspection during that contract, what happens with that? Well, it's just that one form that's being satisfied or waived. So any contingencies that are being asked to be waived during that time before the home goes under contract are just waiving that one contingency. Would it be helpful if I brought up the whole form at one time?
Sure, if you want to. I mean,
Yeah, to say sure. And if I'm on mute.
Yeah, because I just want to make sure that, first of all, everybody is in a remote comfort level with looking at this form. So let me pull up the form really quick, and I'm going to kind of go off this whole little script at the moment, and I'm going to pull from the forms on the Northwest MLS just to kind of go through really quick what the form is. And I don't know how comfortable everybody is with actually using it. It has, I feel like we have varying comfort levels of this form. Please feel free to chime in if you have anything you need to add or questions, or I need to slow down. All right, pulling up the form now. So here it is. I'm just going to run through it really quick so we are all on the same page at least. When you have a buyer that has to sell, you're going to want to add the Form 22B. As a listing agent, you may want to do a little bit of research on where the home is, how they're pricing it, what they're doing to market it, so you know how likely it's going to be that they do sell it. The seller doesn't really have control over too much of that contract on the other side, but they can make an informed decision if they see that a property is overpriced. So be a part of that conversation if you are accepting an offer with a 22B. Also, make sure you're in constant communication with the agent listing the home if it's out of your area or if you're not the other person on that side, because there are things that will come up in this process that could directly affect your client, which would be the seller. You'll want to put, like I said, the contingent sale property. This is the property that they are listing and going to try to sell in order to purchase the new home. It is negotiable now, where you don't have to use 5 days to get it on the market. You can do a different set of days. This is nice because, you know, you can properly market the house and get it ready instead of feeling like you need to rush it with cell phone pictures. You might have a better chance of actually selling the home if you could put a little bit more time into getting it ready. Now, there are two situations where these changes have been really subtle, but very detrimental if you don't notice them or don't keep them in mind at the back of your head. You as a 22B seller, so if you are making an offer on another home and need to sell your home, you cannot accept an offer that has another 22B, a 22Q, which is the pending sale. So you can't be pending on your new sale and you can't be contingent on your new sale. And whatever offer is accepted has to close between 30 and 45 days. Outside of these, you're definitely going to need permission. And the way we get permission is from the Form 90L. I did bring these up in my slides, so I'm going to go through them as soon as I run through this form as well. In order to get permission from the seller, you need to send in this form. There will be boxes checked very specific on what is and is not acceptable. Now, the loan application is the only part of this form that has a time frame that can start after mutual acceptance. So every timeline in the 22B is going to start at mutual acceptance of that first offer being accepted. That means once you sign and your 22B buyer signs, earnest money is due within that timeline. Inspection contingency, septic well, if there is one, financing, everything is dependent on that first mutual acceptance date. It is negotiable that you can change that for financing. Now, you may not want to consider doing that if you are a seller, though, because what you're saying is, I'm going to let you tie up my home off the market for an unspecified number of days. It could be anywhere between, 30 days. It could be however many long days past that you've negotiated in here. So knowing that this buyer is financially qualified is a really important step. But you do have the option in box 3 to check their application for financing to be done at mutual acceptance or at the time the contingency is satisfied. So meaning at the time they have sold the home they told you they were going to sell to buy yours. The property does have to stay on the market until it sells. Everybody's got to give their good faith effort to make this happen. So a buyer is required to leave it on the market until the time in paragraph 4, or until it sells, or until they waive or satisfy the contingencies. The definitions of satisfying the contingencies are in the paragraph 5. I didn't actually take a snippet from this paragraph, but what it means is if you get an offer as the 22B buyer on your home that you're selling, you have to give notice to that seller within 2 days, including a copy of the contract that shows that you have satisfied the contingency. If you don't do this, there's no real tangible consequence for this. But if you don't do this, you're opening up your buyer or your seller, depending on who you represent, to potentially getting bump notices, potentially waiving the contingency. It just kind of opens up a can of worms that we don't want to open. So please, best practice, give this notice. If you give this notice, make sure when you send it over to that seller that the property does in fact close between 30 and 45 days. Count it if you have to. If it doesn't, get that permission signed before you send it over, because sending this, accepting this is going to definitely result in a waiver of every contingency, and you will be closing. All right, so that's the form in its entirety. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the slide and kind of already answered this question. So when do the timelines start using a 22B? All the timelines are at mutual acceptance. Like I said, all other contingencies, everything in this contract is as if the 22B does not exist. So please keep in mind your timelines. Make sure you're turning in earnest money right away. Make sure you're offering your buyer a home inspection during those first few days. Keep in mind timelines don't follow the home that needs to sell. It follows the home that did sell. So what happens if you don't give notice? You've made it all the way to the contingency period and you get an offer. And in your excitement, you neglect to notify the seller that they've either waived or satisfied at the end of the home sale contingency timeline. So what happens? Well, your contract will automatically terminate if you don't give notice. So please make sure you give notice. It is possible to get back into contract if you genuinely do forget to give notice. You can reinstate your contract with a 34. You can reinstate the contract and just exclude the 22B. So if you have two cooperating people who want this to work out, you both just kind of dropped the ball and didn't do your paperwork right, you can actually reinstate your contract. Okay, so as kind of, I guess, a refresher, when you need permission to accept an offer, we've now changed it to 30 to 45 days. And make sure that there's anytime that there's a contingency involved, you get seller's permission. There are terrible consequences if you don't. This is the waiver of completely every contingency. You will close. Buyer will lose their earnest money if they cannot close. If you give an offer with any of those things that needed permission in the beginning. So here, I just wanted to circle the paragraph with the change. This is the only change in this form. Everything else is the same, but what they have also done is they've added verbiage on which forms to use. So there's no confusion. So here, I have some scenarios. So say you receive a 22B and the closing date has to be determined on your offer with the contingent 22B. Or the buyer decides they don't want to buy the house and they only have the 22B contingency in place.
I'll say something.
Thanks.
I first of all would have countered the TBD with a specific date that fell within that 30 and 45 days. But if we had TBD, that's a good question. Because you don't have a established close date.
Yeah, so the 22B contract is really like one of the only ones that can have a little more of an ambiguous closing date, because what controls the closing date is the sale of the home you're waiting to sell. So writing a TBD for a 22B sale is not going to be the end of the world. It won't negatively affect your client too much. You can just put a closing date. You could put an arbitrary closing date. And what happens is specific forms override general forms. So the specific form of 22B and what it says about that closing date is going to already override what you put on the front face of Form 21. So putting TBD is not the end of the world. Ideally, we should be writing C22B because we don't know a closing date. So if a 22B buyer decides they don't want to buy a house and have the 22B contingency in place, technically by contract, they should be attempting to sell their home, having the 22B, and in not attempting to do that, potentially puts them in a place where they are violating their part of the agreement. I want to talk about giving notice now. So you've got your home sale, your buyer is 22B, and they get an offer. They want to give you notice that they have sold the contingent sale. So how do we do that? There is a form 90K, which is what we use to give notice. They've actually consolidated some of these forms in the form updates. So here I have the entire form, and it's, an all one piece right here. Once you get an offer, you can either waive or satisfy the contingency. If you have an offer in hand that you can attach to this that meets the requirements, there's no reason why this contingency should not be satisfied and not waived. So your only two choices here are to satisfy it or waive it. It makes it pretty clear which one to do because one says the buyer's property has sold and the other one says the buyer's property has not sold. If you have sold the property, make sure you are attaching the offer to this form. If you get towards the end of your timelines down here, you can actually click options for failing to turn, failing to close, so you can get your earnest money back. Or, hey, I didn't close, but I still want to buy it because I have the means to do so. So you can click the failure to close and contingency waived. Now, if the seller gets this along with a copy of the offer that you sent in, and they see that it's actually violated a couple of those things or one of those things, for instance, they have accepted an offer with a contingency, like a 22B or Q, without permission, or they have chose a closing date that is outside the parameters of 30 to 45 days, the seller does have their option right down here at the bottom to terminate because of the terminate because of the unapproved sale. This right here refers back to the buyer's waiver of their contingency protections. They no longer have that contingency to hold on to. So I just wanted to pull it up a little bit closer. When you accept an offer, it's box one with the contract attached, or box two that they have not sold, but you want to move forward anyway. And then I wanted to put this up close too. These would be for situations the buyers fail to close and reinstate would be for a situation where the buyer gets under contract and then falls out, say in the first week or two, and you still have the contingency timeline to sell the home. So they'll just reinstate the contingency. They'll try again to sell it within that time allowed. Failure to close just means they've moved towards the end of their entire contingency period and they can't sell their home. They've tried their best, they get their earnest money back. Failure, again, is just the fact that they have gone through the contingency period, unable to sell the home, but they want to buy the new home anyway, and they're going to go ahead and waive the protection of 22B. Okay, so say they do need permission. There is a form 90L, which is the way you get permission. Permission must be granted if it's got a contingency attached, 22B, 22Q, or the closing date is between or outside of 30 to 45 days. It also needs to be given if you're under contract and you have your closing date established, but something happens along the way and you need to get a closing extension or you want to move the closing date up. So once you've been under contract and you've given notice, that seller now has their closing date. And anytime a closing date needs to be modified after that, you do need consent, and you get consent on this form. If you're going to change the closing date, it automatically is 3 days after the closing of the 22B sale. So make sure you select the bottom if they need to change that. I just pulled the form up even larger right here so everybody could see. Buyer just simply requests, and then they request which one of these they want. Seller can sign them. The agreement dated is the new sale agreement date, I believe. Okay, so some odd situations. So what if your buyer has a property they want to sell before buying, but they don't really have to sell it to get the funds for the new purchase? Would you use a 22B? Yes, no, maybe, maybe. it's all going to depend. This is really not a one answer question. It's more or less just to think about this a little bit outside the box. So if you have a buyer who doesn't have to sell a home, you can use the 22B. It does offer the protection of trying to sell it. But if you end up getting through the entire contingency period without selling it, you are going to be in a position where you'll have to either waive or satisfy. And if you can't satisfy the contingency, they're going to waive it. That means no protections will follow you and you will be closing in 30 days. So you may or may not be better using either just an evidence of funds, bringing in other contingencies that might help protect them, or if they're really, if they're really solid on it, using a 22B, knowing that they're going to give up their protections those last 30 days, may be the right decision for them. I don't know. There's not a one answer for this one.
But yeah, I go with that being said, with that situation, because that situation I think comes up more often as we get further along in our real estate career, where we'll have people that are just like, they have the means, they have no problem, they can do it without the sale of their home, but it's just like they feel that they need this insurance policy to get out. And so if we can explain to them that your offer is actually weaker, and once you waive the 22B, you've waived everything, that it actually benefits them to go in without it, especially with negotiations and in a market where there's no inventory right now. So
yeah,
makes sense.
That's a really good point too. And as you were talking, I thought you were going to go the other way with that. So in my mind too, I just thought, what if you do have a buyer who is a little on the fence about things and needs a contingency period? If you have a buyer who's, not 100% set, needs that 22B timeline, you can give them a contingency period for 45 days to get out on. And if they can't sell after effort, I mean, they have to prove the effort. They have to actually list the home. So that could be an out for somebody in that way, or it could be in a place where you're putting them in a worse situation. So yes, finding out what they really want, finding out what their motivation is, what kind of funds they have. You may be better off doing a financing contingency than home sale contingency.
And it lets you know how serious they really are. Like, oh, we love the home, but let's just test it. It's like, well, is that worth your time and energy? Do all that versus, okay, hey, sellers, like if you want this home, this is what you have to do to get it, and having that home sale contingency is not always, if you have means,
yes, it's not the best contingency to use. I mean, if given a pile of contingencies, I wouldn't choose this one. And as a seller, I don't know if I would choose it either. So, just keep that in mind. If you have a seller who doesn't have to sell necessarily, but wants to sell, there are other ways that we can help protect them, probably better than this contingency. Here's another situation that has actually happened. So what if no notice is given to the seller? So the buyer does go under contract, but no notice is given. There is not really, like I said, there's not an actual tangible consequence for this. There's no loss of earnest money. It just says buyer's required to give notice. So if this buyer does not give notice to the seller, they're just going to be putting themselves in a really bad situation where they may be served a bump notice. They may be seen as an unfit buyer. So even though there's not really a legal consequence to this, make sure we're doing it because it is the cleanest way and we want to uphold the contract the best way we can. What about MLS status? So here's a situation. Seller 1 accepts an offer from a buyer with 22B. That 22B accepts an offer from another 22B. And the 22B, the second 22B, lists their home. We're going to assume for this, they all had permissions. And the question comes, where a 22B buyer gives notice to all the other sellers that they are now pending and they are no longer contingent, and their statuses in the MLS should be changed to pending. Are they right? So in this weird one, they're not right. All that they've been given is permissions to list and try to sell. But until there's an actual contract where they have a closing date established that can trickle down to the other sales, nobody is contingent. Okay, so what other situations have come up in a contingent sale where you feel were maybe confusing or that you'd like to share?